Welcome back to Bruised Not Broken, Life with Glanzmann Thrombasthenia. For those of you who are new to us, Glanzmann Thrombasthenia is an extremely rare autosomal recessive disorder of the blood in which the platelets lack glycoprotein 2b3a. Hence, no fibrinogen bridging can occur, and bleeding time is significantly prolonged. GT can be life-threatening and is estimated to affect 1 in 1 million. This podcast is presented by the Glanzmann's Research Foundation and myself, your host, Taylor, and your producer, Peter. Today, we are joined by the one and only Dr. Alan Michelson. Dr. Michelson is a pediatric hematologist specializing in platelets. He currently teaches and practices at Dana-Farber Boston Children's. And Dr. Michelson, you're kind of a myth and a legend around here. You've actually diagnosed a handful of the people within our community. Your name is something that I've heard my entire life. It's definitely something Peter's heard because you two have a connection.
Dr. Michelson diagnosed me a while back.
You were how old?
I think I was 8 months.
And Dr. Michelson was able to give your parents a little bit of comfort because you weren't his first GT patient that he'd ever diagnosed. Which was, for something that's 1 in a million, that's got to be slightly comforting that your doctor's like, oh yeah, it's this one thing that I have heard of one time before. Dr. Michelson, I'm excited to meet you. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. And I haven't had the pleasure meeting Taylor before, but I'm watching a video while we're talking. The listeners want to be hearing the audio, but last time I saw Peter, he was an infant. And he now look, I don't know, I'm not sure how old you are, but now very healthy looking, very adult man. And, it's very nice for me to see that too.
So Dr. Michelson, tell us a little bit about yourself. What drove you into becoming a physician?
When I thought about what I want to do in my life, didn't want to end up wondering, what's the point of the job I'm doing? I wanted to do something that was important and useful to my fellow man. I wanted to wake up in the morning and feel good about what I was doing. And I thought becoming a physician was a perfect fit for that. And I think it has been.
So why hematology? What kind of pointed you in that direction?
I specialize in pediatrics before I specialize in hematology. And it's really easier to say why I specialize in pediatrics than why I specialize in hematology. I specialize in pediatrics because as a medical student, I just loved the vibe of a children's hospital. Everyone was so empathic and invested in trying to make children healthy and happy. And then so that was an easy decision for me. So I completed pediatric training, but I knew I wanted to become more expert in some pediatric subspecialty. And all of the subspecialties seemed interesting to me, but at the children's hospital I was working at the time, an opportunity presented itself in pediatric hematology. So to speak, a door opened and I walked through it, and I've never regretted that. And pediatric hematology has been a very fulfilling career for me.
Now, you are in Boston now, and you've been in Boston for how long?
Well, originally I went to Boston in 82 on a Fulbright scholarship. My accent, if you detect one, is from Australia. So I was originally from Australia, did my medical training in Australia, and actually did pediatrics and pediatric hematology training in Australia. But I wanted to do some research and came on a Fulbright scholarship to Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School in 1982. And for some years, including when I diagnosed Peter, I was at University of Massachusetts Medical School in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I came back to Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School about 15 years ago.
Oh, you've been in that area for a while. And you've had some pretty awesome accolades. You can say that you wrote the book on platelets.
I'll say that I edited the book on there are 67 chapters and over 130 being authors, including Dr. Wilcox, who you mentioned, who wrote the chapter on gene therapy. Yeah, it's a 1,300-page book. There's been 4 editions of it. It's just been published in Chinese, and that's been a many decades-long endeavor for me now.
So we talked about how you came over to Boston and everything in pediatric hematology. When was your first encounter with Glanzmann's?
It's a long time ago, but I believe I saw a patient with Glanzmann Thrombasthenia as a medical student in Australia.
Oh,
And,
wow.
it's obviously really rare, as you said, but just like Boston Children's Hospital in Australia, there are very large freestanding children's hospitals. Freestanding meaning they don't see adults, they're only children. So they're very oriented towards children, and they get referrals from all over the state and the country. So I believe I did see a Glanzmann Thrombasthenia patient and a similar rare disorder, Bernard-Soulier syndrome, when I was a medical student. And I certainly connected with the person who was chief of pediatric hematology at the hospital I was working at in Australia. And it really, he and the children with congenital platelet function disorders that I saw really stimulated me into what turned out to be a career-long focus on studying platelets.
How many, because again, like I said before, you've diagnosed Peter, you've diagnosed a handful of patients. I mean, how many have you diagnosed over the years? Because like you said, you're in Boston, you're at one of the foremost best children's hospitals in the country. So of course you're going to get referrals. Have you, I mean, has it been consistent that you've seen one GT patient pop up every couple of years or what?
That's about right, actually. That's a good guess. I do, as you said, because I'm interested in this area, I have been referred a lot of patients who've been diagnosed elsewhere. But I would say in my career, I probably myself diagnosed maybe 10 patients, maybe 12, something of that order. So it's similar. It's not just me, it's sort of similar in other areas
Right.
of medicine, that people who have a particular interest in something become known in the medical community, in the scientific community, and even in the patient community, and tend to get referred those patients or difficult undiagnosed patients. And I say that because it may seem strange when you say correctly, there's only about 1 in a million people who have Glanzmann thrombasthenia, but that's the reason why, I've seen more than the average pediatric hematologist.
It's just so hard for me to wrap my brain around that, considering, there's most doctors that we talk to, they've only encountered one or none throughout their entire careers. So for you to have diagnosed 10 to 12, it's amazing. Now, through those diagnoses and everything, you have treated some of these patients as well, correct?
The 10 or 12 I'm saying I've treated, and
Right.
I mean, actually, not all, because some come from overseas or from some other
Right.
country and then return to where they live. But I've certainly always had at least a couple or more patients that I'm actively following.
So I'm
Mm.
sure having that many patients to kind of refer back to and watch their own journeys and their progress, I'm sure you've noticed that he does present so differently in different children and different people. What is something that you've learned throughout that experience of seeing all of these different types of bleeds? We have some people in the community as kids where it's nothing but nosebleeds, but others it's nothing but throat bleeds or gum bleeds or anything. So what has anything stuck out to you about GT itself?
Well, you're certainly right, of course, that as with, again, really all diseases, if you think more broadly, they can present in different ways and be different in different patients, part of which we understand and part of which we don't. I think what I would say is what I've learned is that even though patients have differing presentations and differing problems, that if you look at the big picture, even though it's a serious, important disorder, for the vast majority of their life, most patients with Glanzmann thrombasthenia lead a completely normal life and away from hospitals and doctors. So it's not a disease like some other diseases where it's an active problem every day, all the time. If you're someone with leukemia, until such time as you're hopefully cured, it's a problem every day, either the disease or the treatment. Whereas with Glanzmann thrombasthenia, most days it's not actually something you might even think of, and certainly not something where you have a medical problem or a side effect from treatment. So I think that's something important to say to parents and to patients when they're old enough, that, yeah, it is a important disorder that you need to be aware of. You can do some preventative things and there are some treatments, but day to day, hopefully, usually, this is actually not going to bother you.
I can kind of see why my parents liked you.
I was
must
going to
have-
say, I was just thinking the same thing. Like, mom would have loved you.
You must have gave them that talk, and then they felt fine, right?
Well, of course, the first talk is often different. I mean, if it's a new diagnosis, which I guess that's what we're talking about, when it is a new diagnosis, it can understandably and should be a shock. I've never been a parent of a patient with Glanzmann Thrombasthenia, but I would imagine that the natural reaction is, oh my God, my child's going to be bleeding all the time. And when I take them out, they're going to start bleeding. And that's why I bring this up, that I think that parents imagine something worse than it is. They imagine a child they're going to be taking them for a walk and they're going to start bleeding. And understandably, they don't have the picture that although, yes, there can be serious bleeding problems, all in all, the patients can lead pretty normal life, except for those hopefully uncommon times when they get a serious bleeding problem. They may have minor bleeding problems more frequently. So I think in some ways, it's a matter of, yes, making the parents and patients, when they're old enough, more comfortable with the diagnosis.
I could see that being the first thought, though, like, my kid's going to get a small cut and they're going to keep bleeding and bleeding. I'm sure.
Right.
How many times have you been asked after people have found out you have a bleeding disorder? Well, what had happened if you were to get cut right now? Like,
Yeah, they think the worst.
Yeah. So I can definitely see that.
Have you seen a shift over the years with parents being more afraid of the diagnosis?
I mean, I would say no, because virtually no parent would be aware of the diagnosis before for understandable reasons. I mean, if I said your child has hemophilia, there's a good chance they would have heard of hemophilia, but, they may have heard of platelets, but, what are the chances they've heard of Glanzmann Thrombasthenia? So I'd say at the first diagnosis, I think there's no difference because, I mean, to be blunt, I don't recall ever a family actually knowing what Glanzmann Thrombasthenia was when they were first diagnosed. Now, maybe you're referring to if a patient's diagnosed somewhere else and they come to see me, say, for a second opinion, but that would be my answer, that there's just, as is completely understandable, essentially a complete lack of knowledge about Glanzmann Thrombasthenia in the general population. And, that I don't think is going to change because of how rare it is.
We've noticed within our own community that the amount of emergency room visits has actually increased, or the amount of hospitalizations has actually increased. So I think that's where curiosity came from, because there's more than we've ever seen. There's more medical intervention from the word go than there has been before. I think we're trying to figure out if that's been coming from like increased awareness and
Or decreased awareness.
it's for some reason are super commonly on the table still, which is something that we again are like, hold on a second. And then there's a lot of prophylaxis treatment going on right now too, which is something that we've been very curious about over the past few years. So before a bleed happens, like if they know they're going somewhere or something, or I think, Peter, what do joint bleeds too? Like a suspected joint bleed, you infuse yourself at home. So we've just been very curious as to that and wondering if it's popping up on your end as well.
You can probably tell by my reaction that I'm actually not aware of that, but you guys probably have more information in that regard than me. I would relate it back to one of the responses I gave to you earlier, that, most of the time, most patients with Glanzmann Thrombasthenia don't have bleeding.
Right.
And so, I would not be in favor of regularly prophylaxing them with Novo 7. I'm totally fine, of course, with prophylaxing them if they have some indication, like they're going to have some surgery or they're actively bleeding. But to prophylax on a regular basis, I would not be in favor of. And, all treatments have some potential side effects, including Novo 7. I don't think that would be a wise thing to give it regularly, because I don't, of course, know the personal history of even Peter, who I haven't seen for very many years, but I'm going to assume that, like most patients, I hope this includes your little sister and Peter, don't have bleeding all the time. So therefore, there's no benefit to giving Novo 7 all the time. So yeah, I would not be in favor of that. When you said it may be more awareness, and I glibly said it may be unawareness, then, that may actually be true here, that, at least in my opinion, that would not be optimal treatment.
Now, Dr. Michelson, are you currently conducting any research on GT, or because I know you are doing some research with platelets right now?
I actually more or less retired 2.5 years ago. Don't anymore see patients specifically. I still retain the titles of Professor of Pediatrics and Medicine Emeritus at Harvard Medical School and Director Emeritus of the Center for Platelet Research Studies, which I directed for many years initially at University of Massachusetts Medical School in Worcester, Massachusetts, and then at Boston Children's Hospital. I guess the short answer is that I'm retired. I still do academic work, and I'm making moves to publish a 5th edition of the book Platelets, which will be a lot of work.
That's exciting, though, 5 editions. That's awesome. They've decided to keep using your textbook. Just based off of, again, you said you retired about 2.5 years ago, which makes sense. But what do you think that our outlook is for GT? I know that, Dr. Wilcox, his approach with gene therapy, and we've I feel like we've been on the cusp of, just give us 10 more years, for it seems like 20 years now, but it really has started to kind of pick up. Glanzmann has started to become a more whispered word out there in the research field. It's seeming like we're getting more and more interest every single day, which is exciting. But what do you think the next 10 years is going to possibly look like?
Well, first of all, from my perspective as a, physician researcher, Glanzmann's Thrombasthenia has always, in the scientific medical field, had a lot more airplay than you might think, given how rare it is. And the reason is that Glanzmann's Thrombasthenia is a lack of actually the most important molecule on the platelet surface that helps platelets to stick together and help make a blood clot. And so for that reason, it was actually key in the history of platelet research so Glanzmann's Thrombasthenia patients were studied, learn what their problem was, and what was learned was that they lacked this very important molecule, which previously hadn't even been identified. So with regard to treatment in the future, I think it is unfortunate how there's really no specific treatment for Glanzmann's Thrombasthenia. Yes, you can give a platelet transfusion, but that's temporary and not without risk, because you can develop antibodies to glycoprotein 2b3a, the missing molecule or reduced molecule in GT. So I think for the future, yes, gene therapy is the most promising, and unlike currently available treatments, holds the promise of curing GT. And as Dr. Wilcox has probably talked to you about, you actually don't need to cure it outright. Just elevating the level of GP2B3 on the platelet surface is sufficient. Just by way of simple proof of that, you mentioned at the very beginning that Glanzmann's Thrombasthenia is autosomal recessive, meaning there are patients or there are people who are carriers of Glanzmann's Thrombasthenia. Those carriers have no predisposition to bleeding at all. And yet, if you measure the amount of GP2B3A on their platelets, it's hard, which is not surprising. They have the 2 genes involved in GT. But it demonstrates that even a 50% reduction in GP2B3A does not cause bleeding. So the relevance of all that to gene therapy is that you do not have to fully correct GT to stop the patient bleeding, and probably even 20% restoration of GP2B3A would be sufficient. So gene therapy, I think, does have great promise, and I would say you're very correct statement that for now almost decades we've been saying, well, in 10 years' time it should be here. I would again just take a broader view that that's so true in all diseases. Sometimes things happen fast, it's unpredictable, but it happens a lot that treatments seem to be on the horizon. And yes, it'll be here in 5 years, at most 10, and then 20 years go by and it's not here. But in general, many of those treatments do make it to be very good treatments. And, gene therapy, as you may know, had some, not just in Glanzmann's, but had some major setbacks along the way that really slowed down the field.
Yeah.
It's very much moving forward again. And, to ask myself a question and answer, if the question is, do I think gene therapy will eventually get to patients and benefit specifically patients with GT? My answer is yes. I do think that. I think that's pretty, extremely likely.
Yeah.
But what's harder to predict is the exact timeframes.
At this point, it really is just kind of the lack of funds, the finding the money, push through the clinical trials for this. And then, of course, each leg of it gets a little bit more expensive, but that's just part of the red tape of the research world. And we're excited that we're at this point now where it's just the money that's stopping us. So we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that Dr. Wilcox is able to do those clinical trials and get everything moving forward. Because like you said, the approach and everything, we actually went to Wisconsin last year and we went through his lab and he was explaining that. And I think you're correct that the 20% was the minimum that he was going to try to correct to and go from there to see if it worked. The whole thing is extremely exciting. Now, you've had the diagnosis discussion multiple times over the years. You've had multiple patients throughout the year. So you've dealt with a lot of parents with a newly diagnosed child. You kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but what is the advice that you would give a parent that's received this diagnosis and is just, like you said, terrified? They have no clue what it is.
Well, I'd obviously give them specific medical advice, but I think what you're asking me perhaps is, well, along the lines I said before, that I think the natural reaction is when you explain there's a molecule that's missing or almost completely missing, and it's very important for stopping bleeding. I think their natural reaction is, my child's going to bleed all the time. So as we talked about before, I think it's really important to explain to them that fortunately the answer is no. Your child most of the time is not going to bleed. It's just at times they may, and there are particular issues that need to be addressed, like surgery. So I think that can be helpful. I think, and I'm not just saying this, I'm talking to you guys, but I've always thought it's very important for them to try and meet other parents who are parents of children with Glanzmann Thrombasthenia. And I don't remember with your mother, Peter, but I do remember with other patients I subsequently diagnosed, I called your mother and asked her, would it be okay with you if you talked to parents, these other patients? And she was very gracious and wonderful and said she would, and she did. And I actually don't know the history of your organization, but that may be how it started. But in any event, I think it's really helpful to talk to other parents, and ideally, and actually by definition, they would be parents who had received the diagnosis of their child previously and therefore had developed some experience and knowing what this looked like long term. And of course, now that there's an actual organization, it's wonderful that they can just plug in with you no matter where they live, with the benefits of the internet. So I think, that's really important because it's so rare. I mean, again, just comparing to hemophilia or leukemia, the same is true there, but it's simpler. All major centers have many patients with hemophilia, many patients with leukemia. So come to our parent meeting that we hold once a month or whatever. But with such a rare disorder, 1 in a million, there'll be very few patients, if any, at that particular institution. And so I mean this sincerely, your organization is just a fantastic resource for newly diagnosed patients.
we're pretty proud of it. It started in 2001. I think Missy found Mom back in 2002, 2003. And it started off as just one of those old school, early aughts, like message boards. And then Facebook happened and we created a support group on Facebook. And yeah, it just kind of took off from there. But now I think we're close to like 800 members in our support group, which is amazing. And we have people all over the world, which is a lot of fun. And then hearing different ways and different approaches. One of the things that was recently told to me was we have somebody who has a really bad nosebleed and they've tried everything and they can't get anything to work. He's in the hospital, all of that. And one of the girls goes, has he done salt work up his nose? And so I was like, I completely forgot that was one of those things that people recommend every once in a while. But to have a forum like that where you can just pass along knowledge is amazing. So, but the fact that you were connecting GT parents from the very beginning is awesome. Not very many providers, I think, realize how important that sense of community is. Again, like I said, it keeps growing. 1 in a million, I think that puts us at possibly 8,000 on the planet.
Many or probably most of whom are undiagnosed, of course. So yeah, that's amazing. I didn't know that 800 people is just really phenomenal. That is really shockingly good. Congratulations. That's really wonderful.
Peter has gotten our internet visibility up. So the past 3 years when Peter and I stepped into our roles, I think we started off with maybe 400 people in the support group. And just within the past 3 years, Peter's work has doubled the amount of people that we have.
I'll give you a little anecdotal proof of seeing you're giving Peter the credit. I'll say Peter's work. So just for interest, while I was waiting to go on the call today, I just went to the internet and I typed in Glanzmann's, and the very first thing that came up was your group.
Perfect.
I'm about to say, Peter, that worked.
Because, if a doctor types it, fine, good that he knows. Well, actually, yeah, the doctor types it's good that he knows there is a support group. But for the patient who goes home and thinks, what is this? And types it, it was literally the first thing that came up on my computer. I use Google. So for Google and hopefully other searches, you've done a great job of, I don't know if you made it come up first, but it does come up first. I mean, just think of someone in any country, no matter where they are in the world, they type in Glanzmann's and the first thing they get is your organization. That's wonderful. And I'm sure that has everything to do with why you've been able to grow so well.
He's got this little smile on his face.
Yeah,
it was
all me. It was all me.
Because he works so hard. I get scolded on a regular basis not to use certain words and certain posts and stuff because he knows how to make it where we're first on there. So Dr. Michelson, you did mention the importance of having community during a diagnosis, to getting in touch with other GT parents, which brings me to our couple of news items. So registration for the Glanzmann Research Foundation's first educational conference is open. You can register now at www.curegt.org. And we will continue to announce more and more speakers and their specialties via our website and social media. We do have an event page for the conference, and we have released some more information in that. We are going to be announcing a lodging grant coming up soon. There will be applications that are going to be hitting the website on April 1st, and we're going to close that out on May 1st. So that'll be 30 days to get those in, and that will cover your hotel room. Remember that there are a limited amount of slots available, so if you know that you're going to join us, go ahead and grab your ticket. And last but not least, don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast. This will increase our visibility and help spread awareness of Glanzmann. And thank you to our listeners, and a special thank you to Dr. Michelson for joining us. And remember that you may be 1 in a million, but you are not alone.